The plate shattered against the dining room wall before Simone Carter even understood what she had said wrong. Sweet potato and glass scattered across her mother's cream carpet, and for 3 long seconds, nobody at the table moved. Her brother Terrence stared at his lap. Her sister Vanessa's mouth was still open from the accusation she had just hurled across the turkey and the candied yams, and her mother, Loretta, stood at the head of the table with her hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to keep her own heart from climbing out. "You heard me," Loretta said, her voice shaking with something colder than anger. "Get your things and get out of my house. Tonight, I don't ever want to see your face at my table again." Simone's ears rang. 27 years old, and she was being thrown out of the only home she had ever known, on Thanksgiving, in front of aunts and cousins who had already stopped chewing to watch the show. "Mama, I didn't take anything from Grandma Corrine," she said, her voice cracking. "I would never." "Save it," Vanessa cut in, arms crossed, diamond studs catching the chandelier light. Bryce found the missing withdrawal slips. $8,000, gone, right after you moved in to take care of her. You think we're stupid? Simone looked around the table for one face that believed her. She found none. She gathered her coat from the hall closet with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, aware of every eye on her back. Every whisper passed behind a raised napkin. Her Aunt Pauline murmured something to her cousin Denise that ended in, "Always thought that girl was too good to be true." Nobody stood up to walk her to the door. Nobody said her name gently, the way you'd say it to someone you still loved even while you were angry with them. She stepped out into the cold November night alone, got into her car, and sat in her mother's driveway for 11 minutes before she could make herself turn the key, because some part of her was still waiting for someone to come out and tell her this had all been a terrible mistake. Nobody did. 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Simone had left her apartment and her job flexibility behind to move into her grandmother's house on Willow Street after Corrine's hip surgery left her unable to manage stairs alone. She worked 12-hour shifts as a home health aide during the day and came home to cook, bathe, and sit with her grandmother at night, reading her the Psalms she loved until she drifted to sleep. Nobody asked her to do it. Her mother was consumed with grief over Simone's father, gone 2 years now from a heart attack that still haunted the family's finances. Vanessa was busy building the appearance of a perfect marriage to Bryce Reeves, a real estate agent whose confidence outpaced his actual commissions. Terrence was 20 years old and still finding his footing, so Simone did what she had always done. She showed up. There was a night in August that Simone still carried with her, one of the ordinary evenings nobody else had been there to see. Corrine, unable to sleep from the pain in her hip, had asked Simone to sit with her and talk, instead of reading scripture for once. She talked about being 19 years old in Alabama, about the man she'd almost married before she met Simone's grandfather, about how frightened she'd been the first time she held Loretta as a newborn and realized nobody could tell her how to be a mother. "You remind me of myself before the world convinced me to be careful," Corrine told her that night, squeezing her hand. "Don't let them talk you out of your own softness, baby. It's not a weakness. It's the strongest thing you have." Simone Carter had been the family's anchor for as long as anyone could remember, the one who hosted every holiday, remembered every birthday, and quietly slipped money into envelopes for whichever grandchild was struggling that month. When she passed away in October, peacefully, in her sleep, in the room Simone had painted a soft yellow for her that spring, the family's grief curdled fast into something uglier. There was a house on Willow Street worth close to $200,000. There were savings accounts nobody had fully accounted for. And there was Simone, the one who had been alone with Corrine for months, an easy target for whispers that started quietly and grew louder every week. The resentment had not appeared overnight. Vanessa had stopped by Willow Street exactly twice in those final months, each visit shorter than the last, and each time she left, more agitated than when she arrived. "She talks about you like you hung the moon now," Vanessa had said to Simone in September, arms crossed in the kitchen while Corrine napped upstairs. "I'm the one who sends her flowers on her birthday every year. You just happened to be around." Simone hadn't known what to say to that. She hadn't moved in to compete for anyone's affection. She had simply been the one who could rearrange her life when it mattered, and some part of Vanessa seemed to resent her for it more than she resented herself for not doing the same. Bryce was the one who found the bank statements first, or so he claimed, sliding them across Loretta's kitchen table like evidence in a courtroom. $8,000 withdrawn in 4 transactions over the final 2 months of Corrine's life. Simone's name wasn't on any of the paperwork, but she was the only one with access to the house, the only one who drove Corrine to her appointments, the only one who could have known the pin written on a sticky note inside the kitchen drawer. Nobody stopped to ask why Bryce, a man who sold houses for a living, had been so quick to pull his mother-in-law's private banking records in the first place. The family meeting happened without her. By the time Simone learned that Vanessa and her mother had already spoken to a lawyer about protecting the estate, the decision had hardened into something she couldn't talk her way out of. Loretta stopped answering her calls. Terrence sent one text, 3 words long. "This ain't right." Then, silence. The Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a peace offering. Simone's last attempt to sit at the table and explain herself before the holidays became one more thing the family took from her. Instead, it became the night they told her never to come back. She spent that first week sleeping on the couch of Renata, a co-worker from the home health agency who didn't ask many questions and didn't need to. Simone cried until she couldn't anymore, then got up the next morning and went to work anyway, because Bills didn't care that her family had disowned her. Word moved through their church the way it always did, fast and merciless. Women who had known her since she was in the choir now looked past her in the grocery store. Someone started a rumor that she'd been caught on camera at an ATM near the house. There was no camera. There was no footage. But by the time the story reached the third cousin, it was treated as fact. The Sunday after Thanksgiving, the choir director, a soft-spoken woman named Sister Calloway, who had taught Simone her very first solo at 13 years old, pulled her aside before rehearsal with an apologetic look that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Given everything going on, sweetheart, maybe it's best you sit this season out." Simone understood immediately what was being asked of her. She collected her folder of sheet music, thanked Sister Calloway for years she genuinely had loved, and walked out through the side door so she wouldn't have to pass the sanctuary full of people who had already decided who she was. What hurt worse than the accusation was the silence underneath it. Nobody in her family asked her, directly and privately, what had actually happened those final months. Nobody wondered aloud why a woman who had given up her own apartment to care for a dying grandmother would suddenly, secretly, start stealing from her. They wanted an explanation that didn't require them to feel guilty about how little they had shown up. Blaming Simone was easier than sitting with the fact that she was the only one who had truly been there. 2 people did not turn away from her. The first was Miss Odessa Fields, Corrine's best friend of nearly 40 years, who lived 2 doors down on Willow Street and had watched Simone grow up running errands for both old women on Saturday mornings. The second was Renata, who eventually convinced Simone to move into her spare bedroom for real, rent-free, until she got back on her feet. "You're not what they're saying you are," Odessa told her one evening in December, holding her hand across a kitchen table that smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Corrine knew that too, better than anybody. Simone took a job at a bakery on weekends to bring in extra money, on top of her agency shifts, and slowly, without any plan to prove anyone wrong, she began rebuilding something that looked like a life. She found a studio apartment near the bus line. She started sleeping through the night again. She stopped checking her phone for messages from her mother that never came. It was not forgiveness yet. It was survival, and for a while survival was enough. There was something steadying about the bakery, about the 4:30 mornings and the flour dusted across her forearms, and the regular customers who knew her only as the young woman who remembered their orders and never once asked about her family. Nobody there had heard the rumors. Nobody there looked at her like she was something to be managed. For the first time in months, Simone got to simply be a person again, instead of a story other people told about her. In January, Odessa mentioned something odd almost in passing. "Corrine had me holding on to a little tin box for her," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. Said if anything ever happened to her, and things got messy with the family, I was to give it to whoever needed the truth the most. Simone asked what was inside. Odessa said she'd never looked. Corrine had asked her not to, and 40 years of friendship meant that request still held even after death. Simone didn't chase it right away. She told herself it was probably nothing. Old photographs or expired coupons, the kind of thing elderly women kept out of sentiment. But the thought sat with her for weeks, quiet and persistent, the way a question does when some part of you already suspects the answer matters. By February, Vanessa's marriage had begun showing cracks that the family either couldn't see or refused to look at directly. Bryce's real estate deals kept falling through. Vanessa started selling her handbags online under a fake name. Terrence, home from his second semester, mentioned to Simone through a mutual cousin that things at the house on Willow Street felt different since Simone left, quieter in a way nobody wanted to admit. The estate lawyer had frozen the sale of the house pending the resolution of the missing funds question, which meant nobody was getting their inheritance until someone found an explanation everyone could live with. In March, Loretta finally called, not to apologize, to ask, coldly, if Simone knew anything about a locked file box that the estate lawyer said Corrine had mentioned in a note attached to her will. Simone said she didn't. She wasn't lying. She hadn't yet connected it to the tin box Odessa had described. Terrence called her the same week, late at night, his voice lower than usual. I never really believed it, he admitted. Not all the way. But I didn't say anything either, and I've been sitting with that. Simone didn't let him off easy, and she didn't need to punish him further either. You were 20 and scared of Mama, she told him. I get it. But next time, say something while it still matters. He was quiet for a long moment, then said he would. It wasn't much. It was, at least, honest. And honesty had become rare enough in her family that she noticed it immediately when it showed up. It was Odessa who put it together first, calling Simone late on a Tuesday night, her voice tight in a way Simone had never heard before. I think I know what your grandmother meant, she said. I think it's time. The tin box, when Simone finally opened it at Odessa's kitchen table, was smaller than she'd imagined, the metal cool and slightly rusted at the corners, the kind of box that had probably held recipe cards or buttons decades before Corrine repurposed it for something heavier. Inside were exactly 3 things: a stack of photographs of Simone as a little girl, sitting on Corrine's porch steps, a savings bond in Simone's name that Corrine had apparently been adding to for over a decade without telling anyone, and a sealed envelope, Simone's name written across the front, in her grandmother's careful, slanted handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages long, dated just 6 weeks before Corrine passed away. My dear Simone, it began, if you're reading this, then things have likely gone the way I feared they might, and I am sorry for that more than you know. I want you to know the truth before anyone else twists it into something it isn't. The letter explained everything. Months before her death, Corrine had discovered that Bryce had been quietly borrowing against her accounts, first with her hesitant permission during a rough patch in his business, then without it, forging her signature on 2 separate withdrawal authorizations when she refused to lend him more. Corrine had confronted him privately in September, furious but unwilling to blow apart her granddaughter's marriage without giving him a chance to make it right. Bryce had promised to repay it before anyone found out. Corrine, already weakening, decided to document everything instead of trusting his word alone. She photographed the forged signatures. She kept copies of the real withdrawal slips beside the altered ones. She wrote down the dates and the conversations, in case her health failed before Bryce kept his promise. I know my daughter and Vanessa will look for the easiest answer instead of the truest one, the letter continued. I know how this family talks itself into believing what's comfortable. That is why I am leaving this for you, and only you, because you are the one who never once asked me for anything. You sat with me when everyone else was too busy grieving your father to grieve me in advance. You read me my psalms and you never made me feel like a burden. I have added to a savings bond in your name for 11 years, since you were 16, because I always knew you would be the one who needed it least and deserved it most. I think back on that night in August often, the one where we talked instead of prayed. I meant what I told you. Your softness was never a weakness, and I am sorry that loving this family the way you do has cost you so much. I have watched you give pieces of yourself to people who rarely thought to ask if you had anything left over. I do not want you to become hard because of what I fear is coming. I want you to stay exactly who you are, and I want the truth, when it finally comes out, to be the thing that protects that softness, instead of destroying it. Use the evidence in this box only if you must. I would rather you have peace than victory. But if they take your name and drag it through the mud, you have my permission to set the record straight. Simone read the letter 3 times before she could speak. Odessa sat across from her, quiet, letting her have the moment. It wasn't triumph Simone felt first. It was grief, sharp and sudden, for a grandmother who had seen this coming and tried to protect her from beyond the grave. She didn't march into her mother's house waving papers. She called the estate lawyer first, a measured man named Mr. Whitfield who had handled Corrine's affairs for 15 years, and asked him to review the documents with her before anyone else knew they existed. He confirmed within 2 days that the signatures were forged, that the withdrawal pattern matched exactly what Corrine had described, and that the evidence was more than sufficient to clear Simone's name and expose the real source of the missing funds. The family meeting Simone finally called, in April, took place in Mr. Whitfield's office instead of anyone's dining room. Loretta arrived tight-lipped, expecting another argument. Vanessa arrived defensive, Bryce beside her, jaw set like a man who still believed he could talk his way past anything. Terrence sat closest to Simone, close enough that his hand found hers under the table before anyone had said a word. Mr. Whitfield laid it out plainly, the forged signatures beside the real ones, the dates matching Bryce's business troubles down to the week. Vanessa's face changed first, disbelief sliding into something that looked almost like relief, that it hadn't been her sister after all, followed immediately by horror at what it meant about her own husband. Bryce tried to explain, his voice climbing, words tumbling over each other about temporary loans and misunderstandings, until Loretta, staring at her mother's careful handwriting, describing the confrontation in September, told him to stop talking. "You let us call her a thief," Vanessa said to Bryce, her voice low and shaking, the diamond studs from Thanksgiving nowhere in sight now. "You let me call my own sister a thief, in my mother's house, in front of everybody, and you knew the whole time." Bryce reached for her hand, and she pulled it back like his touch had burned her. Terrence finally spoke, quiet but firm, the first time anyone had heard real anger from him in months. She read Grandma her psalms every night for 4 months. That's what she did with her time. "Y'all owe her more than an apology." "She knew," Loretta said quietly, reading the letter herself now, her hand trembling against the page. "She knew all of it, and she still let us believe our own daughter did this." The shame in the room was heavy and immediate. Nobody looked at Simone, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't yet find a way to. It took Loretta 3 days to call. When she did, she didn't ask for forgiveness right away. She asked if she could come see Simone's new apartment, the one Loretta had never once visited. Simone said yes. The conversation that followed wasn't clean or complete. There were tears, apologies that came out clumsy and unfinished, and long stretches of silence where neither of them knew what to say. But it was a beginning, and Simone had learned by then that beginnings mattered more than perfect endings. Vanessa left Bryce within the month, once it became clear the forged withdrawals were only the surface of debts he'd been hiding from her for over a year. She showed up at Simone's apartment unannounced one evening, no makeup, eyes swollen, and simply said, "I'm sorry." I chose to believe the easy story because the real one was too embarrassing to look at. Simone let her in. She didn't pretend the wound was gone, but she poured her sister a cup of tea anyway, because that was what her grandmother would have done. Simone never sued Bryce, though Mr. Whitfield told her she could have. She let the family quietly settle what he owed the estate, and she asked, instead of a payout for herself, that a portion of her grandmother's savings bond go towards something Corrine would have wanted. In September, on what would have been Corrine's 74th birthday, Simone opened a small respite care fund through her agency, offering a few free hours of home health support each month to families in the neighborhood who couldn't otherwise afford the help. She named it the Simone Carter Caregiver Fund. The ribbon cutting happened on the porch of the Willow Street house, one final gathering before the new owners took possession the following week. Loretta cried before Simone even finished her short speech, dabbing her eyes with a tissue Terrence had thought to bring. Terrence brought 3 of his college roommates to help set up folding chairs and a table of lemonade, proud in a way he'd never quite managed to say out loud. Vanessa stood near the back beside a folding chair she hadn't sat in, quiet, present, still learning how to show up without being asked twice. She caught Simone's eye once during the ceremony and mouthed the words "thank you," and Simone nodded back, not because everything between them was healed, but because it was a start, and starts had come to mean something to her now. Simone still visits Willow Street sometimes, sitting on the porch steps where the old photograph had been taken all those years ago, the house home now to a young family with 2 kids who play in the same front yard Simone once did. She doesn't carry the anger anymore, not because the betrayal didn't happen, but because she finally understands what her grandmother had known all along. Love doesn't always get treated fairly by the people closest to it. Sometimes the ones who show up quietest are the ones who get doubted loudest. But the truth doesn't always arrive when you need it most. Sometimes it waits, patiently, in a locked box, for the one person steady enough to be trusted with it, and steady enough to use it with grace instead of revenge. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Mind Maze Tales so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.